The International Court of Justice has ruled against Japan, saying the country's annual Antarctic whale hunt is not for scientific purposes. The court says Japan's scientific reasons cannot be justified and that the country is breaking international law. Australia brought the case against Japan to try to stop hunting in the Southern Ocean. And Andrew Thomas is live for us in Sydney. Tell us more about this ruling, Andrew.
Well, I've just spoken to a lawyer who calls this a comprehensive victory for Australia. For much of the 2 hours that it took for the judge at the International Court of Justice to read out the judgment, it looked as though it was going the other way. The court found, broadly speaking, that Japan's objectives were scientific, and that you would think would lead it to conclude that its programme overall was scientific. But crucially, it said that while its objectives were scientific, the way it went about achieving those objectives, and crucially the number of whales it was killing every year to achieve them, was clearly not scientific. And it's because of that, a lack of analysis as to why it needed to kill as many whales as it did, that it found overall Japan's scientific programme was not scientific. If it wasn't scientific, then it couldn't be justified under the exception to the general whaling moratorium. What does it mean in practice? Well, it should mean the end of Japan's whaling programme. It should mean that Japan can't catch any more whales under the guise, as the court found, of science. Now, the lawyer I've just been talking to has cautioned that that may not be the end of the story, because the court did not find that no whaling could ever be for science. So it may be that Japan takes on board what the court has said, goes back to the drawing board and comes up with another whaling programme that the court can say is science. I think it would have to be at a much lower level of whaling than the current allowances that the Japanese gives to its whalers, but it could still go ahead with a whaling programme, albeit in a scaled down version. And of course Japan also has the chance, if it wants to, although it'd be very politically difficult, but it could withdraw from the internationally agreed whaling convention overall. It could absolve itself from its commitments under that. That's another way that Japan could carry on. But for the time being, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. For the time being, this is very good news for Australia, very good news for environmental groups who have said for a long time that Japan's annual whaling programme isn't for science. That's just a ruse. It's really about commercial whaling. The court, broadly speaking, has agreed.
OK, obviously this is very significant. What sort of impact has Japan's whaling for so-called scientific reasons had on the whale population in the world?
Well, that is a moot point. Very difficult to agree. If you talk to environmental groups, they will say that whale numbers that were decimated in the last century are only very slowly recovering, and Japan's annual whaling programme isn't doing much to help that. Importantly, though, when it comes to certain species, humpback whales, for example, although Japan's scientific programme, so-called, allows for the capture and killing of humpback whales, none have actually been killed under it. And ironically, that was one of the things that the court said meant that the science was rubbish, because they said if Japan can still maintain that its science is achieving its scientific aims, while at the same time not actually catching anything like the number of whales it says it needs to achieve that, then surely the science is bunkum. When it comes to the humpback whale population, hasn't actually been affected by Japan's whaling programme, because Japan hasn't been catching any humpback whales. Minke whales they have been capturing in big numbers. Different estimates reckon there are about 700,000 to 1.1 million minke whales still out there. Japan's caught around the 10,000 mark, so a relatively low level. But the principle of the thing, I think, is what the environmental groups have been talking about. If Japan were allowed to get away with whaling on that scale, maybe in time they would ramp it up. And that was the danger with this court case. Had the court found the other way, had the court said that Japan's whaling programme was legitimate, would Japan have ramped it up? And what impact would that have had on the whale population?
All right, thanks for that, Andrew.